At 4 in the afternoon on a cold Thursday in November, in South Boston, a fourth-grade teacher named Delaney Shaw walked into the narrow brick alley beside Halloran Street Elementary and found 3 young men blocking her path in the alley. She was 27 years old. Her cream cardigan was worn through at both elbows. She had a canvas bag full of spelling tests she hadn't graded yet, and there wasn't much left in her bank account. And around her neck, on a thin silver chain, hung her mother's wedding ring, the only thing that came out of the fire whole. They knew her name. They knew which grade she taught. They knew exactly what time she walked out. One of them had his phone up, filming her. They called her every ugly word they could think of, and she didn't answer. They blocked her path, and she stood there and asked them, politely, if they planned on moving. And that's when she noticed the one holding the phone kept glancing down at his watch. He didn't look nervous. He looked impatient. Then the biggest one leaned close to her face and told her to shut her mouth, and he tore the chain right off her neck. It snapped. Papers went everywhere. And Delaney Shaw didn't scream, and she didn't cry, and she didn't run. She looked at the scattered papers on the wet brick, then looked right back into his eyes without flinching. She stood perfectly still, reached into her coat, and took out her phone. 2 rings. Then she said 4 words. "I need you here." 22 minutes later, 4 black SUVs stopped at both ends of that alley, and 11 men got out, and not one of them ran and not one of them raised his voice. The man who walked in first was in his 30s, in a charcoal overcoat, and half of South Boston knew better than to say his name out loud. What happened in the next 10 minutes? Nobody standing in that alley could have predicted, least of all the 3 young men who'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. If this story moves you, hit that like button and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments what city you're listening from, because I'd love to know how far this one travels. Now let's go back to that alley in South Boston, and to the 4-word phone call that set everything in motion. 1 hour earlier, about 4 miles from that alley toward the harbor, on the 2nd floor of the Malone Freight Warehouse, a man was sitting and waiting to hear the sentence that would decide the rest of his life. His name was Emmett Doyle. He had worked as a construction contractor for more than 20 years, and over the last 2 years, he had skimmed materials from 3 projects bearing the Malone name, while also taking a handful of small contracts for the city school district. The room held nothing except an old wooden table, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking the gray water. Rafferty Malone sat across from him with his hands clasped together, and for nearly a full minute he said nothing. Doyle had prepared himself for shouting. He had prepared himself for the things people in South Boston whispered about this family. What he hadn't prepared for was the silence. Then Rafferty opened a drawer, took out a bound file, and slid it across the table toward him. "Go ahead and open it," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice belonging to a man who had never needed to speak loudly in order to be heard. Doyle opened it. The first page was a bank statement. The second was a materials invoice bearing his own signature, and beneath it was the actual inventory report from the warehouse. The 2 sets of numbers didn't match on a single line. By the time he reached the 3rd page, his hands had begun to sweat. The 3rd page was the incorporation record for a company he had never mentioned to anyone, and on it was his wife's full name, along with her signature. "You have 2 choices," Rafferty said. "First, you repay every dollar within 30 days. I burn this file. You never work at this harbor again, but you go home and have dinner with your wife, and she never finds out what happened. Second, I send copies to the Internal Revenue Service, and she goes to court with you because her name is on page 3. Doyle's lips moved. He was about to say what everyone who had ever sat in that chair always said, that he had young children, that he had only done it because he was desperate. Rafferty cut him off before the sentence could take shape. "I know you have 3 children. I know all 3 of their names. That's exactly why I'm giving you the first choice." He paused. "My brother wouldn't have given you any choice at all." Emmett Doyle stood up. He had to grip the edge of the table before he could straighten himself. He walked toward the door with his hands shaking so badly that he couldn't fasten the button on his coat, and he would repay every dollar in 22 days, ahead of the deadline, because for the entire drive home that night, he would be unable to think about anything except his wife's signature on the 3rd page. When the door closed, Cormac Deely stepped out from the corner of the room where he had been standing the entire time. Cormac was in his 40s, had worked as an auditor before doing this, and he was the only person in the organization allowed to tell Rafferty things no one else dared to say. "Padraig wouldn't have given him 30 days, Cormac said. "I know. Padraig wouldn't have given him 30 minutes. I know that too." Rafferty closed the file. "My brother died at 41, alone in a bathroom, and didn't have time to call anyone. I intend to live longer than that. He smoothed the cover of the file with his palm. On the final page, among the list of former clients Doyle had worked for, was the name of a facilities management company Rafferty glanced over and immediately dismissed, the way he dismissed hundreds of meaningless names every week. Weeks later, he would remember that exact moment, remember precisely how the paper had felt beneath his fingertips, and understand that the answer had already been in his hands before he even knew there was a question. But not then. Then he simply pushed the file aside. His phone vibrated inside his coat pocket. He took it out. On the screen was an unfamiliar number, one he had never saved, one that had never called him before. Cormac saw something very strange happen across Rafferty Malone's face, something he had never seen in the 3 years he had worked beside him. He didn't ask who was calling. He didn't need to. Because there was only one person in the world Rafferty had ever personally given that number to, a woman sitting in an empty classroom on a July afternoon, a woman who had told him she didn't need anything, and for 4 months she hadn't called even once. He answered on the second ring. 4 black SUVs pulled up, and their engines shut off almost at the same time. And afterward there came a kind of silence that Allie had never known before. 11 men stepped out. None of them ran. None of them reached inside their coats for anything. They simply stood there, spreading into a line that sealed both ends of the alley. And the way they stood sent a deeper chill through anyone watching than shouting ever could, because it showed they weren't in a hurry at all. Rafferty Malone walked into the middle. He didn't glance at the 3 young men even once, and that was what frightened them most, the feeling of being treated like pieces of furniture that didn't need to be moved yet. He went straight to Delaney, stopped 1 step away from her, then placed both hands on her shoulders. He lowered his eyes to her face, her neck, her hands. "Are you hurt?" His voice was so quiet that only she could hear it. Delaney shook her head. Her throat was too dry for words, but she shook her head. Rafferty held her gaze for another beat, long enough to make sure she wasn't lying, then released her and turned around. "Which one of you has her necklace?" He didn't raise his voice. The question traveled the full length of the alley, struck the brick walls on both sides, and came back, and none of the 3 dared to move. But the human body betrays a person before the mind has time to speak. Brody Kane's hand jerked upward and touched the breast pocket of his coat, a movement so quick and small that he pulled his hand away almost immediately, but it was already too late. He had answered. Rafferty walked toward him. 3 steps. No more. He reached up, grabbed the front of Brody's collar, and pulled him close. And in that moment his face was no longer the face of the man who had just asked Delaney whether she was hurt. Trace Ruddock turned his phone, stepping half a step closer to get a clearer frame of the hand gripping Brody's collar. Behind them, 18-year-old Jonah Reese pulled his gray hoodie lower over his face and shrank back against the brick wall. "Mr. Malone," Delaney's voice came from behind him, not frightened, not pleading. It was the same voice she used when a child in her classroom raised a hand and was about to do something they would regret. The voice that simply called a person's name and waited, never needing to become any louder. "Let him go." Rafferty stood still for 2 seconds, then 3. The entire alley seemed suspended inside that single moment. Then he released him. He stepped back, smoothed the sleeve of his coat, and only after he had settled into his original place did he speak. "Give it back." 2 words. No threat attached. No explanation of what would happen if Brody refused. And it was the absence of any threat that nearly made Brody Kane's knees give way. He reached into his pocket. He had to reach in a second time before he managed to pull it out, because his fingers were no longer obeying him. The silver chain lay across his palm, broken cleanly through the middle, with the wedding ring slid down toward one end. He held out his hand. It was trembling so badly that the chain swayed slightly. Delaney stepped forward. She had to pass directly in front of Rafferty to reach him, and he didn't stop her. She stood before a young man more than a head taller than she was, a man who only minutes earlier had leaned close to her face and told her to keep quiet, and right then he was the smallest person in that alley. She lifted the chain from his palm. She closed her fingers around it. Then she raised her eyes and looked directly into his. "Thank you for giving it back." No one moved. Trace Ruddock lowered his phone halfway without realizing he had done it. One of the 11 men standing behind Rafferty turned his head slightly toward the man beside him. Brody Kane opened his mouth, and nothing came out, because in all 21 years of his life, no one had ever thanked him for doing something he should never have been allowed to do in the first place. "You did something very wrong today," Delaney said. Her voice remained calm. "That doesn't disappear just because you're afraid now. It happened. Someone saw it, and you're going to have to answer for it." She paused. "But you gave it back when you still could have run." "I recognize that." The stack of test papers was still scattered across the wet bricks, everywhere, soaked through and streaked with mud. Delaney looked down. She bent, picked up exactly one sheet, the one with a child's name written carefully in the upper right corner, and lightly brushed the surface with the back of her hand. Then she straightened, folded the paper in half, slipped it into the pocket of her sweater, and left every other page exactly where it lay. She turned and walked toward the end of the alley. From the street beyond, police sirens began to echo closer. Trace Ruddock stopped recording immediately, much sooner than necessary, shoved the phone inside his coat, and he was the first one to leave, walking away before the other two, head lowered and steps quick. Rafferty Malone watched him go. He didn't understand why yet, but he remembered. At the South District Police Station, the person who took Delaney's statement was a female detective named Maura Quinn, her hair tied low, already past 35, and she recognized Delaney the moment she walked through the door. "Miss Shaw," she said, and for some reason her voice softened slightly from the one she usually used in that room. "My daughter was in your class once. Aisling. Do you remember her?" Delaney did. She remembered all of them, every single one, and she told the story of how Aisling had cried for 2 straight weeks because she couldn't make sense of the words on the page, and then by March had stood in front of the whole class and read an entire page aloud without stumbling over a single word. Maura Quinn lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her for longer than necessary. Then she took the statement. Delaney told everything in exactly the order it had happened, adding nothing, leaving nothing out, in the steady voice of someone accustomed to writing reports for people who hadn't been there. When she reached the part about the man with the phone repeatedly checking his watch, Maura Quinn stopped writing. "Tell me that again." He wasn't scared. He was impatient, like I was making him wait. The detective tapped the tip of her pen twice against the table, then said something she would later wonder why she had chosen to say at all. "Miss Shaw, this isn't the first incident like this in the neighborhood over the last few months." Delaney looked up. "How many?" "I'm not allowed to give you a number." Maura Quinn looked at her. "But I can tell you this. Every person who was targeted works in the public school system. No one else. Not one." Outside the window, the rain had eased. Rafferty Malone waited in the hallway for nearly 2 hours, never sitting down, never growing impatient, simply leaning against the wall with both hands in his coat pockets. And when Delaney came out, he straightened. He didn't ask what the detective had told her. He asked whether she'd eaten anything. The late-night diner was 3 blocks away, the kind of place that still had red vinyl booths and a coffee machine that had been running since morning, and the waitress glanced at Rafferty's overcoat exactly once before, never looking at it again. Delaney said she wasn't hungry. Rafferty ordered her a bowl of chicken soup. She finished the entire bowl without realizing she was eating, and he said nothing about it. He waited until she put down her spoon before asking, "Miss Shaw, those 3 knew your name. They knew which class you teach. They knew what time you leave school, and they knew which way you walk." He spoke slowly. "I need you to think carefully before you answer. Is there any reason someone would want you to stay quiet?" Delaney was silent for a long time. She looked down at the empty bowl. Before she opened her bag, Rafferty reached across the table and held out an open palm. "Give me the broken chain," he said quietly. "I know someone who can fix it." She hesitated for a second, then placed the broken silver links into his hand. Then she pulled a cloth bag onto her lap, took out a blue notebook, the spiral-bound kind every teacher had stacked in a cabinet somewhere, its cover frayed along the edges and all 4 corners worn round. She placed it on the table between them but didn't open it yet. "This is going to sound very stupid," she said. "Tell me anyway. The heating system in the east wing of my school keeps breaking. Last winter there were days when the classroom was so cold the children had to keep their coats on while they studied. I submitted a repair request. They sent someone over." He tapped on the pipes for a while, then left. 3 weeks later it broke again. She opened the notebook. "I went to administration and asked them to replace the radiator completely. They told me that if I wanted the funding approved, I had to prove it was a recurring problem. I needed dates. I needed repair request numbers." She turned another page. "So I started writing everything down." Rafferty looked at the page. The handwriting was small, even, slightly slanted to the right. The handwriting of someone who had written on a classroom board tens of thousands of times in her life. Dates, request numbers, names of the people who came to make repairs, notes in parentheses. Then I asked the teacher in the room next door whether she had the same problem. She said she did, and she had something else too, reimbursements for classroom supplies that never came through. She told me I should speak to a teacher who retired last year because she had kept her paperwork. I went to see her. She told me about 2 more people. Delaney closed the notebook and rested her hand on the cover. "That's all it was. From spring until now. I wasn't looking for a crime, Mr. Malone. I was looking for a heater." Rafferty said nothing. Delaney looked out the window. There's one more thing. Go ahead. Near the end of summer, someone reported that I'd been asking questions. I know because the next day the Deputy Director of Human Resources called me in and asked whether I'd been having any difficulties at work lately, in the voice people use when they already know the answer. She gave the slightest shrug. I don't know who it was. There are almost 40 people at the school, and I care about nearly all of them. I don't want to know either. If I knew, I'd have to look at that person's face every morning, and I don't think I could do it. Rafferty held out his hand. May I? She slid the notebook toward him. He turned through every page, not quickly, not skipping a single one, and when he reached somewhere past the 10th page, he stopped. He said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he turned the notebook around, placed one finger on a name that appeared again and again in the contractor column, the same name from one page to the next. Miss Shaw, he said. No one spends money setting up a separate company just to replace heaters in one school. If the waitress at the late-night diner that evening had been curious enough to ask how the two people sitting in the corner knew each other, neither of them would have known how to give a short answer, because it had begun on a July afternoon in an empty classroom, in the middle of summer, when Halloran Street School had only a few rooms still open for remedial classes. Delaney had stayed late that day to reorganize the classroom library. The door opened, and a man walked in, leading a boy of about 9 by the hand. The man wore an expensive coat and carried himself like someone accustomed to having other people step aside for him. But inside a room filled with child-sized desks and chairs, he looked so out of place it was almost funny. He introduced the boy as Aiden. He said Aiden was his older brother's son. He said his brother had died at the beginning of the year. He said Aiden hadn't found his words again since then. That the boy still ate, still slept, still laughed at cartoons, but hadn't spoken again. He had taken him to 3 different people, all of them very good, all of them very expensive, and none of them had been able to do anything. Delaney didn't ask what he did for a living. She didn't ask why a man wearing a coat like that had personally brought his nephew to a public school with peeling walls in South Boston. She simply pulled out a chair and told Aiden to sit down. Then she pulled out a second chair and told Rafferty to sit too. He looked at the tiny orange plastic chair for a moment, then sat down, his knees bent so high they nearly reached his chin, his hands seeming to have nowhere sensible to go, and he remained like that for almost an hour. Delaney didn't ask Aiden a single question. She opened a cabinet, took out a new grid notebook and a sharpened pencil, then pushed both across the table toward the boy. Listen to me, she said. Her voice was ordinary, exactly the same voice she used when telling a classroom to open their books to page 20. You don't have to say anything. No one is making you talk. I'm not either. The boy looked at the notebook. You only have to write one word for me. One word. Any word you want. Whatever word you like, write that one. Aiden didn't move. The clock on the wall ticked. Rafferty sat on the tiny orange chair and felt every passing second stretch unbearably long, and he was just about to say that it was all right. Thank you. We should go. When the boy picked up the pencil, he wrote slowly and carefully, pressing a little too hard the way children do when they truly need the word to appear. 3 letters. He turned the notebook around for the teacher to read. On the page was the word Dad. Delaney looked at it, then nodded. All right, she said. That's a very good word. I'll keep this notebook here for you. Come back next week, and if there's another word you feel like writing, you can write it. Rafferty Malone had to turn his face toward the window. He looked out at the schoolyard, at the rusted basketball hoop and the faded painted lines on the concrete, and he looked longer than an ordinary person would ever look at a schoolyard. When he turned back, his face had returned to normal. Aiden came to that remedial class regularly for the rest of the summer, and by the end of August, the boy had begun speaking again, first to his teacher, then a few days later to his uncle. On the final afternoon, after the boy had run into the hallway to wait, Rafferty lingered in the classroom. He took out his wallet, removed a plain white card, and placed it on the teacher's desk. There was no name on it, no title, no company, only a handwritten phone number. Take this, he said. Delaney looked at the card without picking it up. Mr. Malone, I don't accept gifts from parents. School policy. It isn't a gift. Then what is it? A phone number. He fastened the button on his coat again. Call whenever you want, any hour. You don't have to explain why. Delaney folded her arms. She was tired, at the end of a long summer, and she said exactly what she thought. I'm a teacher. I don't need anything. Rafferty nodded as though that was precisely the answer he had expected. Then he walked to the door and stopped with one hand on the knob. Everyone needs something one day, Miss Shaw, he said. The only problem is that no one believes it until that exact day comes. He closed the door behind him. Delaney stood looking at the card for a long time. Then she opened the teacher's desk drawer, placed it beneath a stack of unused good behavior slips, and pushed the drawer shut. The card remained there throughout the fall. She didn't call even once. Cormac Deely needed less than one morning to find the first thread, and he did it using exactly the kinds of things anyone could look up if they were willing to sit down and look. The state business database, the school district's public bidding records, committee meeting minutes posted on the city's website that almost no one ever read. The name in the blue notebook was Halcyon Learning Group, registered as a company providing school facilities management and maintenance services. Above it was a parent company called Cardigan Bay Holdings, and above that, buried at the third layer inside a shareholder filing no one had any reason to open, was the name Preston Hale. Cormac printed everything and spread the pages across the table on the second floor of the warehouse. "He's the chairman of the city's school facilities committee," Cormac said. "Almost a year ago, he voted to put Halloran Street School on the closure review list. That same year, the company he owns a stake in began receiving maintenance contracts for that very school." Rafferty stood looking down at the table. "What happens to the property if the school closes?" "It's inside the rezoning area for the harbor development project. That whole block is included." Cormac pushed a map toward him. "Public school land can't be sold unless the council declares it surplus. To declare it surplus, they have to prove the facilities have deteriorated beyond reasonable repair, and the man approving the repair contracts is the same man." Rafferty was silent for a long time. "So he pays his own company not to repair anything. On paper, everything gets repaired. Dozens of times every year. There are invoices, inspection signatures, work order numbers, all of it." Cormac tapped a finger against the printout. "The only problem is that the classrooms are still cold." Then he pulled another sheet from the stack and placed it in front of Rafferty much more slowly than the others. "There's something else. I've seen the name Halcyon before." Rafferty looked up. "Where?" "The last page of Emmett Doyle's file, in the list of companies he'd worked for." Cormac looked at him. "You had it in your hands the other day. You closed it and pushed it aside." Rafferty said nothing. He remembered exactly how the paper had felt beneath his palm. Remembered smoothing the cover of the file. Remembered letting his eyes pass over that column of names without really reading it, because every week he saw hundreds of names, and none of them meant anything. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "I had it in my hands," he said. "There was no way you could have known." "No." Rafferty looked down at the table. "But I still had it in my hands." That same morning, several blocks from the harbor, Delaney Shaw opened her mailbox and took out a white envelope bearing the school district seal. She opened it right there on the sidewalk without moving because she thought it was a meeting notice. It was a suspension letter. The reason stated in the letter was suspected misuse of classroom funds. She read that phrase twice and still didn't understand what it was referring to until she turned to the second page and saw the itemized statement. They were her own reimbursement requests. For years, when her classroom supply budget ran out around February, she had paid out of pocket for pencils, squared notebooks, boxes of tissues, then saved the receipts and submitted them for reimbursement. Some requests had been partially approved. Some hadn't been approved at all. She kept submitting them because she had been told to keep submitting them. Now the entire stack had been arranged into a single statement, and beside every line was an empty box waiting to be checked. The meeting at the school district office that afternoon lasted less than 20 minutes. 3 people sat across from her, and not one of them looked her directly in the eyes. They used very soft words. They said this was only a routine review. They said no conclusions had been reached. They said that while the review was underway, she wasn't permitted on school property. Delaney asked how long the review would take. They said there was no determined timeline. She asked who had requested that the review be opened. They said that was part of the internal process. Then, they pushed the acknowledgement form toward her and asked her to sign, confirming receipt of the notice. And Delaney picked up the pen, and as she lowered her head to sign, her eyes passed over the lower left corner of the page, where a line of very small print listed the date the file had been opened. Her pen stopped. She read the line again. The date printed there was a day in September. She sat very still. Outside the window, a bus stopped and then pulled away. The 3 people across from her waited for her signature. She signed. She didn't ask another question, because she understood that if she did, they would answer with the same soft words, and because she needed time to think carefully about the fact that a financial investigation file bearing her name had been opened before that November afternoon in the alley, long before then, back when she hadn't even known the faces of any of those 3 young men. She walked home. Halfway there, she stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk, and the person behind her had to step around. Suspension meant no paycheck. No paycheck meant the city's health insurance contributions stopped, and the city's health insurance was the only thing paying for Nessa's 3 dialysis treatments every week. The news reached Rafferty Malone at nearly 7 that evening, while he was sitting behind the wheel of his car in the parking lot behind the warehouse, with Cormac in the passenger seat. Cormac repeated exactly what he had heard, without adding a single word, including the small printed date in the corner of the report. Rafferty said nothing. He placed both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield at the brick wall in front of them, and Cormac sat quietly watching him, and then he saw something he had never seen once in the 3 years he had worked beside this man. Rafferty's hands were shaking. "Hale's home address," he said. "No, Cormac, no." Cormac didn't move. "Do you want me to tell you why, or do you already know?" Rafferty tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The leather gave a faint creak. "She spent months on this," Cormac said. "Since spring, she went to one person after another, wrote down every date, kept every work order number, and she did all of it alone, when no one had told her she had to. What she's holding in her hands is the only thing in this whole mess that's still clean." He looked over at him. "If you go to Hale's house tonight, tomorrow morning no one will be talking about 3 broken heaters anymore. They'll be talking about you, and her notebook will become worthless because your name will be attached to it." Rafferty sat still for a very long time. Outside, a ship horn sounded from somewhere near the harbor. Then he released the steering wheel, lowered his hands into his lap, and opened his palms as though checking whether they were still shaking. "Call the best lawyer we know," he said. "Not our lawyer. I don't need someone to defend me. I need someone who knows how to write an administrative appeal to the school district and knows how to read an education labor contract." He started the engine. "Her lawyer, Cormac, not mine." Delaney's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building where the wooden staircase creaked on the 4th step and the 9th. When she opened the door and let him in, the main lights were off. Only the lamp above the kitchen table was on. Nessa was asleep in the room beyond. On the kitchen table, in the place where dishes should have been, sat a wide-mouthed glass jar, the kind people used for pickling vegetables. Its lid screwed on tightly. Inside was loose change, coins and a few bills folded into quarters, lying in a disorderly pile, as though they had been placed there by many different hands, at many different times. Wrapped around the jar was a sheet of squared paper. There were 31 signatures on it, every one different, some written entirely in capital letters, some scrawled into little circles, some running down onto the line below because there hadn't been enough space. Above the signatures was a sentence written in pencil, the strokes pressed hard into the paper. "Miss Shaw, we know you didn't take anything. The parents brought it this afternoon," Delaney said. "They left it at the door and went away. Probably thought I'd be embarrassed." She pulled out a chair and sat across from the jar. She didn't open the lid. She didn't touch it. She only sat looking at it with both hands in her lap, and Rafferty stood in the middle of the kitchen and understood that she had been sitting like that since daylight. He sat down in the other chair. "Miss Shaw, your pay stopped today." "Yes." "Then the insurance." "That stops too." She said it in the voice someone might use to read the weather. "It might stay active until the end of the month. It might not. I have to call and ask, but the office closed at 5. Rafferty took out his phone. He dialed a number, spoke for less than a minute, using exactly 4 short sentences, then ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. "It's taken care of," he said. "All of your sister's treatment costs, starting this week, will be paid through a separate account. No insurance involved. You don't have to do anything." Delaney looked up, and Rafferty Malone realized he had just done something wrong, though he hadn't yet understood what it was. "What did you just do?" "I took care of it." "You didn't ask me." She stood. The chair scraped against the tile behind her. "You're sitting in my kitchen. You pick up a phone. You decide the biggest thing in my life in less than a minute, and you don't ask me a single question. Delaney, your sister needs—" "I know what my sister needs." Her voice broke in the middle of the sentence, and she let it break. "I know better than anyone in this world. I was 19 when she came to live with me. I signed her hospital admission papers. I sit outside the treatment room waiting for her 3 times a week. I know." She pointed toward the phone lying face down on the table. "Do you know what has happened over and over again my entire life? People make decisions for me. They move me into another house. They move me to another school. They close one file and open another. And not once does anyone sit down and ask me what I want. When it's all finished, they turn around and tell me I should be grateful. And I am grateful. I've been grateful for 27 years. She stopped to breathe. "I don't want one more person doing that to me. Not even you." Rafferty remained still. He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. No one in his life had ever spoken to him in that voice. And the strange thing was that what rose inside his chest wasn't anger. He picked up the phone, called the number again, and said exactly one sentence. Cancel the transfer I just ordered. Then he set the phone down and looked up at her. All right, he said. Then tell me what you need. Delaney stood there, breathed out, then sat down. I need a lawyer, she said. Not to threaten anyone. I need someone who knows how to write an insurance appeal. 2 years ago, my sister's transplant eligibility file was denied, and I wrote the appeal myself, and I made a mistake somewhere that I still don't know how to find. She looked at him. That's all. Don't give me anything else. There was one name in the blue notebook that Delaney had written down in April and never returned to, because the first time she knocked on the door, it had opened only a crack, and the woman behind it had said, I have nothing to say to you. The name was Marguerite Kovash. She had taught at Halloran Street School for 33 years, teaching 5th grade for most of that time, and she had retired several years earlier than planned without a farewell gathering, without flowers, without a single line in the school newsletter. This time Delaney called first. She said she had been suspended, and that she was no longer coming as someone from the school district. Mrs. Kovash was silent on the phone for a moment, then said she might as well come. Her apartment was on the ground floor of a 4-story building, its windows facing a concrete courtyard, and there were more books in the living room than there were places to put them. She opened the door, saw Rafferty standing behind Delaney, and frowned briefly, but didn't ask. She told them both to sit down, then went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. She carried the tray out with both hands. She set it on the table, lifted the pot to pour, and her hand shook so badly that the tea spilled over the rim of the cup, ran into the saucer, and gathered there in a pale brown ring. She set the pot down, wiped the spill with a paper towel, then picked it up again to pour the second cup, and this time she had to use her left hand to support her right wrist. No one said anything while she poured. At some point, Rafferty had risen from his chair and gone to stand beside the window with his back to the room and his hands clasped behind him, and he remained that way through almost the entire conversation. Delaney waited until Mrs. Kovash sat down. Then she opened her cloth bag, took out the blue notebook, turned to a page marked with a scrap of paper, and placed it open on the table, turning it toward the older woman beside her cup of tea. I wrote down our conversation from April, Delaney said. You only said a few sentences to me at the door, but I wrote them down anyway. I wrote everything. The date, the time, what you said. Marguerite Kovash lowered her eyes to the page. At the top was her full name, written in small, slightly slanted handwriting. Beneath it was the date. Beneath that were several lines of notes, and in parentheses was one sentence Delaney had copied word for word from that day. She read it. Then she read it a second time, and then the hand that had just been shaking too badly to pour a cup of tea rose to cover her mouth, and she began to cry. She cried without sound, her shoulders trembling in waves, and she kept looking down at the page as she cried. Delaney said nothing. She pushed the tissue box toward her. Mrs. Kovash waved it away. I'm sorry, she said when she could speak again. I'm sorry, Miss Shaw. It isn't because of the job. Please don't think it's because of the job. I don't. 33 years. She placed one finger on the page, directly beneath her own name. I stood inside that building for 33 years, and when I walked out, there wasn't a single piece of paper anywhere saying I had ever been there. Nothing. I kept thinking that eventually no one would remember, and I couldn't blame anyone for that either. People are busy. She looked at Delaney. Then you came here. You sat down, and you told me someone had written my name down. The tea slowly went cold on the table. Outside in the courtyard, someone dragged a trash bin across the concrete. I need you to tell me what they did to you, Delaney said. Mrs. Kovash nodded slowly. Then she told her. She told her about that autumn, when they called her in and said very gently that the school was restructuring, that at her age, early retirement might actually be a good thing, that they had already prepared a transition payment for her. She told her about the document they gave her to sign, 4 pages long, and one clause stating that she wasn't permitted to discuss the condition of the school facilities, the budget, or any internal procedures with anyone. She said she had read that clause at the time and understood exactly what it meant. I signed it anyway, she said. Do you understand? I still signed it. Delaney asked where the money was now, and that was when Mrs. Kovash looked up, and her face changed, and her voice became dry. I spent it all, she said. I spent it that same year. She turned the teacup slowly on its saucer. My husband was sick. He was in the hospital for almost 4 months. My insurance covered part of it, but not the rest. The bills came to the house every week, one after another, and I opened every one of them right there on the front steps, the same way you opened your envelope. She looked down. I used that money to pay my husband's hospital bills. Every last dollar. He died the following spring, and I didn't owe anyone a cent. No one spoke. Mrs. Kovash clasped her hands tightly together on the table, and this time they weren't shaking. For years now, I've kept thinking about one thing, she said. If I still had that money, I could give it back. I could put it on someone's desk and say, I don't want it anymore. Here it is. They would look at me and they would know I wasn't bought. But I spent it. I spent it on something decent. On the most decent thing I ever did in my life. And that is the worst part. She raised her eyes, red but dry. Because now I can't buy back my own silence anymore, Miss Shaw. I have nothing left to redeem. What I sold is gone. And what I traded it for is gone too. Rafferty was still standing with his back to the room, facing the window. He didn't turn around, but he spoke, and both women startled because he hadn't said a single word until then. Mrs. Kovash. Yes, you really don't remember me. She frowned at his back. I'm sorry, 5th grade, he said. Last desk, by the windows. The boy who never turned in his homework and argued with everything you said. You kept him after school for an entire semester, every day. You made him read aloud to you, and he hated it so much that he swore when he grew up he would never read another book again. He turned around. You were the first person in my life who wouldn't let me give up. Marguerite Kovash looked at him. She looked for a very long time, long enough that Delaney thought she hadn't recognized him. Then she lifted one hand to steady herself against the edge of the table and called his name, first and last, exactly the way a teacher calls a name during attendance. Then she said softly, You still bite your nails like that. The man who knocked on the 3rd-floor apartment door on a Tuesday morning introduced himself as Gareth Loomis, an attorney, and said he had come on a referral from the teachers' union. He was in his 40s, wearing a gray wool coat and carrying a soft leather briefcase, and he had the kind of courtesy that belonged to a man who had sat in thousands of kitchens, exactly like this one. He declined coffee. He asked permission to sit. He placed the briefcase on his lap and opened it, and every movement he made was slow and steady. Nothing in any of it that gave a person reason to be wary. Miss Shaw, I won't waste your time, he said. Your review is moving in a very bad direction. I've read the file. Technically, they have enough grounds to move to disciplinary proceedings, and if they do, your teaching license will be suspended while the matter is pending. That can last a very long time. Delaney sat across from him. The glass jar was still in the same place on the table, unopened. I didn't take a cent from the school. I know, Loomis said, and he said it so naturally that Delaney believed he truly did believe her. But that isn't what decides the outcome. What decides the outcome is who has more time and who has more money to keep pursuing it. He took out a bound packet of papers and placed it on the table, turned it toward her, then slid a pen over with it. This is a settlement offer. I'll read you the main terms. He turned the page. You withdraw every statement you have given to the police and to any other agency concerning the school's operations. You sign an agreement not to discuss the district's budget, facilities, or internal procedures with any third party, with no expiration date. In exchange, the review is closed this week, with no finding and nothing entered into your professional record. You return to work next Monday. You receive all back pay for the days you were suspended. He paused for one beat. And your health insurance is reinstated retroactively to the date it was terminated. That means there is no interruption in coverage. On paper, that interruption never happened. Delaney said nothing. He pushed the pen slightly closer to her. Miss Shaw, I've been doing this a long time. I know what you're thinking. But I also know your sister has dialysis 3 times a week. And I know this is the first week you've had to pay for it yourself. Delaney's phone was lying face down beside the pen. It vibrated once. She turned it over. A message from Nessa. Hey. They changed the juice flavor at the hospital today. Now it's pear. And it's awful. Please remember to buy me the old apple kind. Beneath it was a smiling face. Delaney stared at the words. Not one of them was a plea for help. Not one mentioned bills, illness, or fear. It was simply a 19-year-old girl complaining about the flavor of juice. Exactly the way a 19-year-old girl ought to be allowed to complain, and it was that ordinary thing that pressed down on Delaney's chest so heavily that she had to put the phone back down. She reached for the pen. Gareth Loomis didn't move. He had sat in many kitchens, and he knew exactly when to remain silent. Delaney turned to the last page. There was a line, and beneath it her name had already been typed. She lowered the tip of the pen to the paper. It touched the page. In the cloth bag hanging from the back of her chair was the blue notebook, and she couldn't see it, but she knew it was there, and she knew how many names were inside it, and she remembered the face of a woman who had stood in a classroom for 33 years, sitting in front of a cup of tea that had spilled into its saucer, saying that she couldn't buy back her own silence anymore. Delaney lifted the pen from the paper. She set it down on the table. "Mr. Loomis," she said. "Yes? How many people have you given this agreement to?" He didn't blink. "I'm not permitted to answer that." "Were the terms the same? That clause with no expiration date?" "Miss Shaw, do you remember Marguerite Kovach's face?" Something very small moved across Gareth Loomis's expression. It lasted less than a second, and if Delaney hadn't been looking directly at him, she would have missed it. "She taught 5th grade at my school for 33 years, Delaney said. "She signed a paper like this one. Yesterday I sat in her home while she poured tea for me, and her hand shook so badly that the tea spilled into the saucer. She told me she couldn't buy back her own silence anymore." Delaney placed both hands on the packet. "Did you sit in her kitchen, Mr. Loomis? Did you slide the pen toward her exactly the way you just slid it toward me?" He didn't answer. Delaney pushed the packet back across the table toward him, all the way until it touched his leather briefcase. "I don't sell other people's names," she said. He remained seated for a little while longer. Then he closed his briefcase, fastened the clasps, and stood. At the door, he stopped with one hand on the knob, and Delaney saw that he was about to say something, saw his shoulders rise and then fall, but in the end he only gave one very slight nod and left. He didn't know that the question he had just refused to answer would follow him all the way home that night, and the night after that, and for many weeks afterward, until the day he picked up the phone himself and called a federal agency number no one had asked him to call. That afternoon, Delaney told Rafferty everything about Gareth Loomis. All of it, including the moment when the tip of the pen had touched the paper. When she finished, he didn't praise her, and she was grateful to him for that. Then she asked him a question she had been carrying in her mind for the past several days. "Mr. Malone, is there anything else you're hiding from me?" He didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, then turned it off again without doing anything with the water, and Delaney realized it was the first time she had ever seen him make a useless movement. "Yes," he said. "One thing." He turned back and leaned against the edge of the sink. "I knew your name before Aiden ever walked into your classroom." Delaney set down her cup. 3 years ago, when I took over my brother's work, I told Cormac to make me a list. I wanted to know whether there were still places in this city that were clean, not because I wanted to give money away. I needed to know where I could put money without dragging something dirty in behind it. He folded his arms. Cormac reviewed every public school maintenance contract in the area. He looked for places where the paperwork matched what actually existed. Halloran Street School made that list. "My school has been leaking since last year." "Yes, but there was something else." He looked at her. The records contained 3 inspection reports that had been rejected. 3 times, the same project. The same refusal to sign. The person who refused was a classroom teacher assigned to the facilities oversight committee. Delaney sat very still. "The East Wing windows," she said. "The East Wing windows. They asked me to sign a form confirming they'd been replaced." She spoke slowly, tracing the memory back one step at a time. "I didn't sign because I was standing right there in that room. I could see the old frames were still there. Some of them hadn't even had all the old paint scraped off. I thought maybe the work just wasn't finished, and the paperwork had gotten ahead of it. I thought it was some procedural thing." She looked up. "Mr. Malone, I swear to you, I had no idea what any of that meant." "You didn't know," he said. "But everyone who sat in that position before you signed." The kitchen was silent for a while. Outside, darkness had already fallen. "So I was targeted," she said, "because I wouldn't sign a piece of paper about some windows. You were targeted because you were the only person in that building they couldn't buy." Rafferty straightened away from the sink. "And I found you for exactly the same reason. The same line in the same file. They read it and saw a problem they needed to deal with. I read it and saw a place where I could send my nephew." Delaney looked at him, and she was about to ask one more question, the other half of what she had asked before, whether there was anything beyond this that he was still hiding. But he had already reached for his coat and said he needed to go, and she let him leave. The next morning, in the second-floor office at Malone Freight, another file lay on the table, much thicker than Emmett Doyle's, its cover bearing the name of a law firm downtown. It contained the bid documents for the construction and operation contract covering the Harbor Warehouse District, the contract Rafferty had spent 3 years preparing for, 3 years obtaining licenses, paying every tax in full, closing out one old arrangement after another, 3 years spent getting the Malone name written for the first time in 40 years on a piece of paper. No one had to lower their voice to read. Malone Freight had reached the final round. On the table beside the file was a typed notice withdrawing from the bidding process, waiting only for a signature. Cormac stood across the table. "Are you sure?" he asked. "If we stay in that bid, then anything we do involving that school gives them a motive to point at." Their lawyers will turn this into 2 companies fighting over a piece of land, and Miss Shaw will become someone we paid to speak. Her notebook won't be worth anything anymore. I know what their lawyers will do. I'm asking whether you're sure." Rafferty picked up the pen. 3 years, Cormac said. "I know. It isn't only you." Cormac placed another sheet on the table. A handwritten list of names. 17 people. 17 people walked away from the work they used to do because you told them that by spring there would be jobs at the harbor, employment contracts, insurance, names on a payroll. Some of them have already told their wives and children. Rafferty looked at the list. The door opened. Sean Prendergast came in, 63 years old, the oldest among them, already walking with some difficulty because of his left knee, and the only man there who still remembered Rafferty's father. He had been standing in the hallway and had heard part of the conversation. "You're planning to ask what we think," he said. "Sean, don't." He came to the table and planted both fists on the wood. "I followed your brother for 20 years. 20 years, and not once did he ask what I thought about anything. Not because he looked down on me, but because he believed asking was weakness." He looked at Rafferty. "Don't learn that from him, but today, don't ask. Just sign it. There are 17 people. I know. I'm on that list." Sean tapped one finger against the paper. "I'm old, Mr. Malone. I don't need a job at the harbor anymore. What I need is for that building on Halloran Street to still be standing where it is." He straightened. "My daughter went to 5th grade there. Mrs. Kovash taught her. Now she teaches all the way out in Worcester, and every time she comes home, she still drives past that school just to see it." Rafferty signed. One clean signature. Then he pushed the withdrawal form across to Cormac. After that, he added one instruction. "No one tells Miss Shaw about this." Cormac looked up. "Never?" "Not now. There was one man in the organization who heard everything about the withdrawal from the bid, and he said nothing at all. Didn't object once, simply stood up and went outside to smoke. His name was Niall Brannigan. He was in his 50s, a man from Padraig's time, and for the past several weeks there had been only one thought in his head, that the younger brother was taking something his older brother would have handled cleanly in a single night and trying to solve it by staring at paperwork. The phone rang at nearly 4 a.m. Rafferty answered on the second ring, and the voice on the other end belonged to a woman he had never heard before. "Mr. Malone, my name is Helena Voss. I'm a federal agent with the Public Corruption Unit. I'm sorry for calling at this hour. I'll explain why I couldn't wait until morning." He sat up in the darkness. "Last night, at around 9 o'clock, in the underground parking garage beneath an office building downtown, a man named Dorian Wexler had his car blocked at the exit. 3 men. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. No one was injured, no one touched anyone, and no complaint was filed." She paused for one beat. "But that garage has 7 cameras. I've watched every one of them. Do you want me to describe the man standing closest to the car door, or can you guess for yourself?" Rafferty closed his eyes. "I can guess." "Good. Then listen carefully. My office is reviewing a case involving public school maintenance contracts in this district. I have a city detective named Maura Quinn who sent us a packet of material, and inside it is a handwritten notebook that, I have to tell you, is about as clean a piece of evidence as I've ever seen." Her voice hardened. "And now I have 7 recordings showing 3 of your men blocking the car of a potential witness. Do you understand what that does to my case?" "Yes. Their lawyers will say Miss Shaw was hired by you. They'll say the notebook was manufactured by your people, and they'll have video to support the claim." Rafferty switched on the bedside lamp. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to open your books." There was the sound of papers turning on the other end. Every record from Malone Freight for the last 3 years, and the years before that too. Voluntarily. No search warrant. No arguing. No lawyer sitting beside you striking out lines one by one. If you do that, I can argue that you have nothing to hide, and that what happened last night was the act of an individual. If you don't, then I have to assume the opposite, and I will assume it very loudly." She ended the call. Cormac was at the warehouse before 6 that morning, and he argued harder than he ever had in the 3 years he had worked beside Rafferty. "You don't understand what you're about to do. I haven't finished reviewing the books from before your time. I got as far back as the year Padraig became ill, and stopped because we had other things to deal with then. I don't know what's in there, neither do you." "That's right." Rafferty stood by the window looking out at the gray water before sunrise. "I don't know. That's exactly why we have to open them. And if you open them and there's something in there, then it was already there, Cormac. It's been sitting there for the last 3 years. Me refusing to look at it doesn't make it disappear." He turned around. "Call Agent Voss. Tell her she gets everything." Niall Brannigan arrived at the warehouse at 9. He went straight to the 2nd floor, pulled out a chair, sat across from Rafferty, and held himself upright like a man who had come to receive a medal. No one raised his voice. The only sound in the room was the pipes knocking inside the wall. "Say whatever you're going to say," Niall said. "What were you thinking?" "I thought that man needed to know someone was watching him. I thought if he got scared enough, he'd leave that teacher alone." He shrugged. No one touched him. No one said anything that could be used in court. "I was careful." "You were careful in a parking garage with 7 cameras. Niall fell silent. "Padraig would have done exactly what I did," he said after a while. "You know he would have." "I know," Rafferty nodded. "My brother would have done exactly that. And my brother would have finished the whole thing in one night, and everyone would have slept well afterward. Then 3 years later I sit at this table and discover there are people still paying for all those peaceful nights." He looked directly at the older man. "My brother died still owing an apology to people he had never even met. I don't intend to die that way." Niall Brannigan lowered his head and looked at his hands resting in his lap. "So what are you going to do to me?" "I'm not going to do anything to you." Rafferty pushed a piece of paper with a phone number written on it across the table. "You go yourself. This morning, you call this number, ask for Agent Voss, tell her exactly what you did, and make it clear that no one told you to do it, that you did it behind my back and against my orders." He paused. "That's the only way her notebook keeps its value." Niall stared at the paper for a long time. Then he picked it up, folded it into quarters, and slipped it into his breast pocket. He stood, and at the door, he turned back. "Mr. Malone." "Yes, I did it because I thought I was helping you." "I know," Rafferty said. "That's the hardest part." There was one more name in the blue notebook that Delaney had written down during the summer, with 2 words in parentheses beside it. "Takes photographs." And she had completely forgotten about it, until the day Cormac asked whether anyone in the neighborhood regularly went walking in the afternoons. His name was Walter Prosky, 68 years old, and he had worked as a custodian at Halloran Street School for 31 years before retiring. Ever since he retired, he had walked a circuit around the neighborhood every afternoon with a small travel camera, and he took pictures. He photographed the building. He photographed the metal roof of the east wing. He photographed the crack running along the wall of the rear courtyard, comparing 1 month to the month before. He photographed unfamiliar cars parked outside the gates when no one was supposed to be there. He took pictures without knowing what he was photographing, the way people keep a diary without realizing they are writing history. On Wednesday afternoon, Walter went to the hospital on the north side for a routine eye examination. He returned home at nearly 7 and found the door to his apartment slightly open. Nothing had been ransacked. The television was still there. The wallet on top of the refrigerator was untouched. The only thing missing was the old desktop computer he used to transfer his photographs. The entire tower gone. The cables ripped loose and still dangling from the outlet. He called Delaney before he called anyone else. "Miss Shaw," he said, and there was no fear in his voice, only embarrassment. "I think I've lost all the pictures." Then he was silent for several seconds. "Though maybe I haven't, because Walter Prosky belonged to a generation that didn't trust anything they couldn't hold in their hands. Every month, he took his memory card to a shop on Broadway Street and had the photographs printed on paper, small size, 4 to a sheet, then cut them apart. And he kept them in the place he considered safest in the world, the place where he had stored things for 31 years, the storage room in the basement of Halloran Street School's East Wing, behind a stack of broken desks, inside a shoebox. He still had the basement key. No one had ever thought to ask for it back. At 11 that night, it was raining. The kind of late November rain that wasn't heavy but was bitterly cold and refused to stop. 3 people stood outside the iron fence behind the school beneath the shadow of a bare maple tree. Rafferty had said he would go inside and get the box, and Cormac had immediately objected, saying that if Mr. Malone was caught on the grounds of a public school at midnight, everything would end right there. Then Delaney said she would go in, and Walter was the one who stopped her. "Miss Shaw," he said, "if you step over this fence, they'll have exactly what they need. You're suspended, and you're not allowed on school property. They won't have to prove you took money anymore. They'll only have to prove you came in here." He fastened the button on his raincoat. "As for me, I'm an old retired man looking for a box of my own belongings. If someone catches me, the worst they'll do is give me a good scolding." He went inside. The side gate opened with his key, giving a long squeal in the rain. Delaney stood gripping 2 bars of the iron fence and watched his stooped figure disappear around the corner of the building. Then there was nothing left to watch, only rain falling across the concrete yard, one yellow light at the corner of the courtyard, and the dark basement door. She stood there thinking about Nessa asleep at home, thinking about the blanket she always pulled all the way up beneath her chin, thinking about what kind of voice she would have to use tomorrow morning if tonight went wrong. Rafferty stood beside her. He said nothing. He didn't take out his phone. He didn't call anyone. All his life, whenever a problem stood in front of him, there had always been something to do, a phone call to make, a name to find, a file to put on someone's desk. Tonight there was nothing. Everything he knew how to do would destroy this case. All he could do was stand outside the fence of an elementary school at midnight and wait for a 68-year-old man to go down a dark staircase. 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. It's been too long, Delaney said. His legs aren't strong, Rafferty said. The basement stairs are steep. Rain ran down inside the collar of her coat. She reached out and took his hand without looking at him, without saying anything. There was nothing romantic in the gesture. It was simply two people afraid of the same thing and needing to know that the person beside them was afraid too. Rafferty tightened his hand around hers. After more than 20 minutes, they heard the basement door. Walter came out slowly, one hand against the wall for support, the other holding something tightly inside his raincoat. When he reached the gate, he passed it through the iron bars before he even stepped outside. It was an old shoebox, all 4 corners reinforced with tape, with 2 faded words written across the lid in marker. Inside, standing upright in tightly packed rows like library cards, were photographs. More than 300 of them. The 3 of them got into the car. Cormac switched on the interior light. Walter opened the box, but he didn't search through it. He simply rested his hand on the edge. "I'm going to tell you this once," he said to Delaney. "Then that's it. I'm not telling it again." He looked out through the rain-streaked window. "My wife taught 2nd grade at this school, almost a quarter of a century. Her classroom was on the 1st floor, right beside the staircase, and I cleaned the hallway outside that room for every one of those years." He gave a faint laugh. "She used to tell me, Mr. Prosky, you're the kind of man who notices the things nobody else notices." She'd been telling me that since we were newly married, and I never could decide whether it was a compliment or a complaint. He tapped one finger lightly against the lid of the box. "She died a few years ago. After the funeral, I just kept walking from one room to another in the house, without knowing what to do with myself. Then one day I picked up the camera, walked past the school, and took a picture of the metal roof on the east wing." He stopped for a moment. "The next afternoon I went again, then the afternoon after that." He looked up at Delaney, his eyes clouded by age and rain. "I photograph that school every day because that's how I still get to go to work with her." Malone Freight's books were turned over on Friday morning. All of them, with nothing held back, including boxes of paper records from before the company had changed its name, stacked in storage so long that the cardboard covers had yellowed. Cormac stayed with them throughout the morning to check the inventory, and he was the one who called back, not anyone from the federal agency. He called at nearly 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing he said was, "Come back here now. Don't ask me anything over the phone." On the table on the 2nd floor of the warehouse, when Rafferty arrived, a file was already lying open. The cover bore the name of a consulting company that no longer existed. The signing date was in the spring of the year Padraig Malone was still alive. The last year he was still healthy. "Sit down," Cormac said. He never told Rafferty to sit down. He pulled the file closer and turned to the first page with a signature. 3 years ago, a payment came into the company. It was listed as logistics consulting. 1 payment. It was large. He tapped a finger against the amount. "I've seen this line before. I saw it a long time ago. I thought it was money Padraig received to settle that strike situation back then, and that was legal, so I let it go." He turned another page, and that is what it was. The client wanted the harbor free of any work stoppages for a certain period of time. Padraig took the money, and during that period the harbor stayed quiet. He kept his word. He never failed to keep his word. "Then where's the problem?" Cormac didn't answer. He kept turning pages, more slowly now, and stopped at one with a small number printed in the lower corner. Page 11. It wasn't a contract page. It was an appendix, the kind people attach to establish context, and it contained a list. The names of public school facilities included in the client's review area, with addresses and city property codes. Cormac placed his finger on the 4th line from the top. Halloran Street Elementary School. Rafferty looked at the words. He looked at them for a very long time. Did he sign for the entire file? Yes. He signed the last page confirming receipt of all 14 pages. Cormac turned to the final page and showed him the signature. Large, slanted, written quickly. The signature of a man who had signed thousands of times in his life, and no longer looked down while doing it. He signed that he'd received all 14 pages, but he didn't read page 11. The room went silent. A pipe inside the wall gave one knock and stopped. "How do you know he didn't read it?" Rafferty asked. "Because if he had," Cormac said, "he wouldn't have taken the money. I worked with him for 8 years. He did plenty of things I didn't agree with, but not when it came to schools. His father went there. He went there. You went there too. He closed the file. He didn't sell that school. He simply never turned to page 11. Rafferty stood and walked to the window. Below, a forklift crossed the yard, its warning signal beeping at steady intervals. "Where is that money now?" he asked. Cormac remained silent longer than necessary. "It's in the company," he said. "It isn't sitting separately anywhere. For 3 years, it's been mixed into operating capital. It paid the rent on this warehouse. It bought 2 trucks last year." He looked up. "And it's in the payroll fund, Mr. Malone. It's paying the men who stood across both ends of that alley last week." Rafferty didn't turn around. He stood looking out at the water for a very long time. And when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "Does Agent Voss know yet?" "No. They've only reviewed as far back as last year. At the pace they're going, I'd guess they'll reach this in about a week. Then I have a week." He reached for his coat. That evening, he sat across from Delaney in the kitchen of her 3rd-floor apartment and told her everything, without hiding a single word, including the part where Cormac had seen the line long ago and passed over it. When he finished, he placed a copy of the file on the table, opened it to page 11, and turned it toward her. Delaney read it. She read the name of her school, typed in black letters in the middle of a list. "You understand what I'm telling you," he said. "Your school has been falling apart for years. During that time, there was a point when things might have turned out differently if someone had spoken. No one did, in part because my family was paid to stay quiet." He looked down at the table. "My brother didn't sell your school. He just couldn't be bothered to read all the way through. Sometimes those are the same thing." Delaney said nothing. She remained silent for a very long time, long enough that he thought she might stand and tell him to leave. She looked at the page, then at the glass jar still sitting in the same place, its lid still unopened. "Are you going to give it back?" she asked. "All of it," he said, "with interest calculated from the day it was received. I've already told Cormac to calculate it. It could drain my company, and in truth, it almost certainly will." "Give it back to whom?" "The school district, with the purpose stated clearly. If they refuse to accept it, I'll put it into the renovation fund for that school itself. And if that fund refuses it too, I'll find another way. But I'm not keeping it." He looked up. "I'm telling you before Agent Voss finds it because I don't want you hearing this from a stranger and having to wonder how long I've known." Delaney closed the file and pushed it back toward him. She stood, put the kettle on the stove, then turned and looked at him. "Then stand up," she said. Brody Kane gave his statement on a Thursday morning, with no family lawyer present because his family didn't have one, only a court-appointed attorney and Agent Helena Voss sitting across the table from him. He talked for nearly 3 hours, and by noon, Voss had called Maura Quinn, and by that afternoon all 3 of them, Delaney, Rafferty, and Cormac. They were sitting in a small conference room on the 4th floor of the federal building, with a screen and a stack of printouts in front of them. "He was paid," Voss said. "Not much. The man who paid him was Dorian Wexler, Director of Community Relations for Halcyon Learning Group. He received an envelope in a parking lot, along with a packet of papers." She pushed the printouts across the table. The first page was a photograph of Delaney taken secretly from across the street, standing at the school gate with her cloth bag in her arms. The second was her work schedule, listing the time classes ended each day of the week, even noting the days she stayed late for staff meetings. The third was a hand-drawn map of the alley beside the school, with an arrow marking the route she usually took toward the bus stop. Delaney turned through the pages without saying anything. "His instructions had 2 parts, Voss said. "The first was to provoke you. The second was to record everything, and they emphasized the second part. Get it on video no matter what, especially if someone showed up." Rafferty sat straighter. "So they were waiting for me. This is the part I need you to hear carefully." Voss shook her head. "No. At first, they had no idea you were involved in any of this." She turned the screen toward them. "What they needed was footage of Miss Shaw losing control. You curse at them, shove someone, start screaming. 30 seconds of that would have been enough." She tapped her pen against the review file beside her. "That footage would have been submitted with this file, along with a memorandum stating that the subject had displayed an inability to control herself in public, and that her statements regarding the school should be evaluated in that context. That would have been enough. No one needed to invent anything. They only needed you to give them 30 seconds. The room went silent. "But you didn't," Voss said. "You stood there and asked whether they were going to move out of your way. For nearly 10 minutes, you didn't say a single thing they could use." She looked at Delaney. "That's why the boy holding the phone kept checking his watch. He had been told he needed footage before you left, and you refused to give him anything." Delaney sat very still. She looked down at the photograph of herself taken secretly outside the school gate. Then she said softly, almost to herself, "So the only thing I did right that day was say nothing." Voss turned to the final page of the packet given to Brody. At the bottom, beneath the notes, were 3 lines printed in small type. She read them aloud. Subject wears a silver necklace, does not remove it during working hours. Noted as an object associated with family. No one spoke. Voss set the page down. "That line didn't come from their own surveillance," she said. "It was copied from a professional psychological assessment. Miss Shaw completed that assessment 2 years ago, voluntarily, after her sister was hospitalized. It was part of the school district's confidential personnel records." Cormac looked up. "Who sold it?" "An administrative employee at the district office. We spoke with that person this morning." Voss closed the file. "The employee accepted a small payment to extract personnel data for, and I'm quoting directly, a survey of teacher attachment to the workplace environment. The employee says they had no idea what the information would actually be used for." "I believe that." She looked around the table. "This is how it always works. People think something like this requires an entire crowd of bad people. It doesn't. It only requires enough people willing to do a task without asking the second question." Then she played the recording. It was shorter than Delaney expected. On the screen was the brick alley in the November afternoon light, with rain pattering against the phone casing. She saw herself standing there with the cloth bag in her arms, and she looked much smaller than she had felt at the time. The video reached the moment the line of cars stopped, then the moment 11 men stepped out, and the person filming began backing away to widen the frame. Then came the moment Rafferty took 3 steps forward and grabbed Brody Kane by the collar. Cormac reached over and paused the video. The image froze, that hand gripping the collar, that face less than a hand's width from the other. 3 seconds, Cormac said. He pointed at the screen. "If you'd held on for 3 seconds longer, we'd be sitting in a different room right now. This clip would have been in the papers the next morning. No one would still be talking about heaters or invoices. They'd only be talking about you." He dropped the pen onto the table. "And that notebook would have become worthless." Rafferty stared at the frozen image for a long time. Then he turned toward Delaney. She was still looking at the screen, and he saw her lips pressed together. "Miss Shaw," he said. She turned toward him. "You saved me before I had the chance to save you." Preston Hale didn't wait for anyone to come knocking at his door. On Monday morning the following week, he sat in front of the cameras at a city television station, wearing a shirt with no tie, his hands resting on the table, and he did what men like him always did when they could smell defeat coming. He moved first. He said he had spent a great deal of time reflecting over the past several weeks. He said he acknowledged that there had been failures in the approval process, that as chairman of the committee he accepted political responsibility for those failures, and that he had submitted his resignation that very morning. His voice lowered exactly where it needed to lower. He paused exactly where it needed to pause. Then, when the host asked whether there was anything else he wanted to say, he looked down at the table for a moment before raising his eyes. "I only want to say this," he said. "I'm concerned. This is about a school, about children, about books. And yet now, somehow, individuals with rather complicated histories in the Harbor District have appeared in the middle of this story. I'm not naming anyone. I simply hope the people of this city will ask themselves why that is." He didn't name anyone. He didn't need to. By that afternoon, the interview had been cut into a shorter clip and was running across every news site in the city. By evening, there were thousands of comments beneath it, and among them were comments about Delaney Shaw. People didn't write that she had stolen anything. They were smarter than that. They wrote that it was strange, wasn't it? That a teacher earning almost nothing suddenly had 11 men in black cars showing up to get her. They wrote that maybe it wasn't so simple. They wrote that of course they felt sorry for her, but by the second day, the school's parent association had split into 2 sides in a group message, and someone suggested that perhaps everyone should wait for the authorities to reach a conclusion first, and the sentence sounded perfectly reasonable. And because it sounded reasonable, it was destructive. By the afternoon of the second day, 2 teachers whose names were in Delaney's notebook called their lawyers and asked to withdraw their statements. One cried on the phone. The other didn't. Delaney sat in her kitchen with her phone face down on the table and didn't turn it over once all evening. On Wednesday morning, a local television van parked outside a 4-story building whose windows looked onto a concrete courtyard, and Marguerite Kovash opened the door. She had called them herself. No one had suggested it. Not Delaney, not Rafferty. No one. She wore a blue cardigan buttoned all the way to the throat, her hair neatly combed, and she sat down in the chair the cameraman set out for her. Her hands rested in her lap, and they didn't shake. "Please tell us who you are," the reporter said. "My name is Marguerite Kovash. I taught 5th grade at Halloran Street Elementary School for 33 years. She spoke slowly and clearly, in the same voice she had once used to dictate spelling words to a classroom. Several years ago, I was asked to retire earlier than I had planned. They gave me a sum of money and a document. That document contained a clause saying I wasn't allowed to discuss the condition of the school facilities or the school budget with anyone. There was no expiration date. I read it. I understood it. I signed it anyway. The reporter started to ask the next question, but she raised one hand very slightly. Please let me finish. She looked directly into the camera. I spent all that money. I spent it that same year to pay my husband's hospital bills. My husband died the following spring, so now I have nothing left to give back. I can't buy back my own silence anymore. She folded one hand over the other, so I've come here to repay it with the only thing I still have. I sit here, I say my name, and I speak. Then she added something no one had asked. I know people have spent the last few days wondering who Miss Shaw knows. She said it in a voice so dry that even the cameraman behind the lens shifted slightly backward. I'll tell you who she knows. She knows me. In all the years I spent inside that building, and in all the years after I left it. She was the only person who ever knocked on my door and asked whether I was all right. That same afternoon, several blocks away, Dorian Wexler sat in a coffee shop on the ground floor of an office building, and Rafferty Malone pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, in broad daylight, alone. Wexler smiled the way people smile when they think they are about to negotiate. Rafferty placed 3 things on the table, one after another, without hurrying. The first was a copy of a rental agreement for an apartment in Dorchester, with 3 months of overdue rent paid in full, the tenant's name belonging to Brody Kane's mother. The second was an application for evening classes toward a high school equivalency credential, completed and signed, with the signature of the person agreeing to sponsor him, and that signature belonged to Delaney Shaw. The third was a photograph printed from the security camera of a convenience store, showing a man handing an envelope to a young man in a parking lot. Wexler stopped smiling. I'm not here to threaten you, Rafferty said. His voice was ordinary, the voice someone might use to ask what time the train left. I'm here to tell you something you don't know yet. The boy you paid has a lawyer now. The person who hired that lawyer is the teacher you sent him to frighten. He tapped one finger lightly against the photograph. You chose the wrong person to buy, Mr. Wexler. You tried to buy a kid without ever bothering to ask who had taught him. Then he stood, took out his wallet, left enough money on the table to pay for both cups of coffee, and walked out the door. 2 days later, Dorian Wexler hired his own attorney, not the attorney from his company, and began talking. The federal court's temporary restraining order was signed on Friday afternoon and was scheduled to take effect at 9 o'clock Saturday morning, and someone on the halcyon side had read that line about the time very carefully. At 6 o'clock Saturday morning, before daylight had fully broken and fog from the harbor was still hanging level with the rooftops, 3 trucks carrying heavy equipment stopped outside the side gate of Halloran Street Elementary School. They weren't doing anything illegal. The site supervisor had a valid demolition permit in his hand, issued months earlier, authorizing the complete removal of the east wing on the grounds that the structure was unsafe. All they needed was for that section of the building to come down before 9 o'clock, and more than 300 photographs inside an old shoebox would become nothing more than pictures of something that no longer existed, and an entire chapter of the federal case would lose the physical place that gave it meaning. The name on the approval line of that permit was Principal Vernon Ashby. He had signed it on a February afternoon inside a thick stack of documents sent down by the school district office. The kind of stack he signed every quarter, one page after another, signing without turning through them. At 5:40 that morning, the site supervisor called him, according to procedure, to confirm the signature of the authorized official. Ashby sat up in the darkness, listened as the man read out the permit number, and understood what he had signed. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call anyone at the district office either. He put on his coat, picked up his car keys, and drove to the school. By the time he arrived, people were already there. In the courtyard, a short distance from the east wing, standing in an uneven line, were the people who over the past several months had entered the blue notebook one by one. Delaney stood near the front of the line with that notebook in her hand, her raincoat buttoned all the way up. Marguerite Kovash stood beside her back straight, both hands tucked into her coat pockets. Walter Prosky stood on the other side, wearing the wool hat he always wore on his afternoon walks. There were nearly 20 teachers. The woman who owned the bakery on the corner and had opened at 5 every morning for years but had closed her shop today. Several dozen parents, and some people carrying thermoses of coffee. It was a day off. There were no classes, and no one had called a single child to come. At the far end of the line, standing slightly apart, was a young man of about 18 in a gray hoodie, both hands shoved into his pockets, looking down at his shoes. Jonah Reese had come on the first bus of the day. No one had told him to come. Delaney saw him, and she said nothing. And she didn't turn away either. Behind all of them, along the fence, Malone's people stood in silence. They didn't move forward. They didn't place themselves in front of anyone. They simply stood there with their hands at their sides, and that quiet presence said more than anything they could have done. Rafferty stood much farther back near the gate, farther away than anyone else, because Cormac had reminded him the night before that the fewer cameras caught him standing close to this school, the better. In the middle of the line was a woman in her 50s whom he hadn't expected to see. She wore a brown coat, her hair neatly tied back, and she was Niall Brannigan's wife. She saw him first. She said nothing. She only gave him a small nod, then turned her face toward the east wing. Rafferty nodded back. Vernon Ashby walked through the gate and into the courtyard, and the sound of his footsteps on the wet concrete was very clear because no one was speaking. He reached the edge of the line and stopped. Some people looked at him and then looked away. Some didn't bother looking at all. No one greeted him. He stood there in the fog, a man in his 50s with empty hands. Among colleagues he had watched in silence as they were pushed out of this building one by one. Delaney turned her head and looked at him. She looked for a long time, long enough that Mrs. Kovash glanced over too. Then Delaney said exactly one sentence. "Stand to my left." Ashby stepped forward. He took that place and couldn't say a word, and for the next 3 hours he didn't move from it once. The site supervisor walked in from the trucks carrying the permit papers, and he began by saying very loudly that everyone needed to disperse, that this was an active work site, and that interfering with construction was against the law. No one moved. Then Walter Prosky stepped out of the line, walked up to him, and spoke in the calm voice of a man who had cleaned the hallways of this building for 31 years. "You're right. Interfering with construction is illegal. That's why we're not interfering with you." He pointed behind him. "No one is standing in front of your equipment. No one has touched your trucks. No one is blocking the entrance." He adjusted his wool hat slightly. "We're only standing in the courtyard of a public school on a day off. There's no law against that." The supervisor began saying something about the construction zone. Walter interrupted him, still calm. "Go ahead and start the machines." "Go ahead." He nodded toward the largest excavator. "Then tell me how you're going to explain to the state labor inspector why you operated heavy equipment with this many people within a 30-foot radius. How long have you been doing this work? You know that regulation already, don't you?" "I knew it for 31 years because every month I had to put that notice back up in the basement." The supervisor stood still. He looked at the line of people. He looked at the excavator. Then he went back to the truck and called someone. And that call lasted a very long time. 3 hours passed. No one shoved anyone. No one cursed. The fog slowly lifted. The sky brightened into a pale gray, and someone in the line began pouring coffee into thermos lids and passing them from hand to hand. Mrs. Kovash accepted one, took a sip, then handed it to Vernon Ashby. He received it with both hands. At 9:10, 2 federal vehicles turned onto Halloran Street and stopped outside the gate. Helena Voss stepped out holding a packet of papers that still carried its original folds, and she walked straight toward the site supervisor. Dorian Wexler gave statements for 4 sessions in a row, and by the 3rd one he finally said the name the entire case had been waiting for, not because he felt remorse, but because his private attorney had told him plainly that the only person who still had a way out was the one who talked first. The second person was someone no one expected. Gareth Loomis called the federal office himself one evening without any referral, and when Helena Voss asked why he was calling, he stayed silent for a while before saying that a teacher had asked him a question in her kitchen and he hadn't been able to answer it for weeks. That night after night he had lain awake thinking about how many people he had pushed that pen toward and how many of them had picked it up. He turned over every agreement he had drafted. All of them, including Marguerite Kovash's. Preston Hale pleaded guilty before the case went to trial. 3 counts: mail fraud, wire fraud, and misappropriation of public funds. His plea agreement contained one provision his attorney tried 3 times to remove, and Voss refused to let him remove: a mandatory restitution fund to compensate every person who had been forced out of a job through silence agreements, paid in full, with interest, including the pension benefits they had lost. Marguerite Kovash had all 33 years of her teaching pension credit restored. She called Delaney the same afternoon the letter arrived. She called and couldn't form a complete sentence, only breathed into the phone, then set the receiver down on the table, and much later picked it up again, and in the end she managed only 2 words, "Thank you," before hanging up. Delaney was reinstated during the 2nd week of December, The review file was closed with no finding, and every reimbursement request she had submitted year after year was approved in a single afternoon. The back pay reached her account on a Friday morning. She didn't buy anything. She took it to the lawyer Rafferty had found for her, the man who hadn't charged her a cent from the beginning, and the two of them sat together for 4 hours, rebuilding from the ground up the appeal file she had written by herself 2 years earlier. It turned out the mistake had nothing to do with the medical grounds. It was in a section certifying household income that Delaney had completed, according to her own understanding. And her understanding had been slightly wrong. Only slightly, but that slight difference had been enough to keep a 19-year-old girl off the transplant list for 2 years. The file was resubmitted. 3 weeks later, Nessa Shaw was officially placed on the transplant waiting list. There was no miracle. No one took a shortcut. No one bought a place. At last, one piece of paper had simply been filled out correctly. That night, Delaney sat on the edge of her sister's bed for a long time after she had fallen asleep. She met Brody Kane at the community center on Hayden Street one afternoon before Christmas, in the room where every week people came to talk about things that were difficult to say. He was already sitting there when she arrived, and he stood when she walked in, and that surprised her. He seemed much smaller than he had in the alley that day. Not physically smaller, but smaller in that part of a person people borrow when they want to frighten someone else. "What did you need the money for?" she asked. He looked down at the table. "My mother was 3 months behind on the rent. She works 2 jobs and it still wasn't enough." He spoke quickly, as though afraid he might change his mind. "That doesn't mean I was right." "No," Delaney said. "It doesn't excuse anything you did that day. You're going to have to carry that with you. And the day it stops feeling heavy is the day I'll start worrying about you." She placed both hands on the table. "But it tells me who you are when you aren't trying to be somebody else. You didn't spend that money on yourself." He couldn't lift his eyes. She opened her bag, took out a sheet of paper, and pushed it toward him. It was an application for evening classes toward a high school equivalency credential. "You dropped out of school when you were 16, she said. "That means our system failed you first. I teach Tuesday and Thursday nights. It doesn't cost anything." Brody Kane stared at the paper, then raised both hands to cover his face, and she sat there quietly until he lowered them again. Halloran Street Elementary School was removed from the closure review list during the final week of the year. The East Wing wasn't demolished. Real repair funding was approved, this time with an independent inspector attached, and on the Saturday morning when the workers came to replace the heating system, several dozen people showed up to help carry things, and Jonah Reese was at the gate 10 minutes before the agreed time, standing alone in the fog with both hands still buried in the pockets of his hoodie. Walter Prosky gave him the job of holding the ladder. He held that ladder all morning and didn't complain once. Delaney learned about the harbor bid from Cormac one afternoon, when he drove her home after their final session with the federal office. He told it briefly, exactly the way he told everything, without adding a single adjective, telling her about the withdrawal form, about the 17 names on the list, about Sean Prendergast planting both fists on the table and saying, "Don't ask what I think, just sign it." Then he fell silent. Delaney sat in the passenger seat looking out the window and said nothing for the rest of the drive. Only when they reached her building did she ask one question, whether Rafferty had told him not to tell her, and Cormac answered that he had said not now, and by this point now had been a long time ago. On the final evening of that school term, Rafferty Malone came to the school after dark, just as Delaney was locking her classroom door. He handed her a small box. Inside was the silver necklace, repaired where it had broken with a new link noticeably thicker than the old ones, and her mother's wedding ring rested at the center, shining beneath the hallway light. "I had them make it stronger," he said. "It won't break there again." Delaney lifted the chain. She put it on, and it took her a moment to fasten the clasp. "There's one thing I've kept to myself from the beginning," Rafferty said. He looked out across the dark schoolyard. "That phone number I left on your desk in July. From that day until the alley was 4 months. Do you know what I did during those 4 months?" "What did you do?" "I watched my phone," he said it very calmly. "Every day. Not because I was afraid something would happen to you. I was afraid you'd never call." Delaney stood still for a moment. "I didn't call," she said, "because I didn't want to owe you. My whole life, whenever anyone gave me something, sooner or later I had to repay it with something I didn't want to give. You never owed me anything." He turned and looked at her. "You wrote Mrs. Kovash's name in a notebook when no one told you to. You wrote Walter's name. You wrote all of them, one by one, in that tiny handwriting of yours, and carried it in a cloth bag for months." He paused. "All my life, I've learned only one thing well, how to erase people's names cleanly. You don't owe me anything, Miss Shaw. It's the other way around. She stepped forward and kissed him, there on the steps outside the school, beneath a December streetlight casting a yellow pool across the wet concrete. And from inside the building, at the first-floor classroom window where Aiden was sitting waiting for his uncle with a notebook on his lap, came the tap of knuckles against glass, and when the two of them turned, the boy had his face pressed to the window, grinning widely, then lifted the notebook to show them. On the page he had just finished writing 2 words, large, careful, pressed hard into the paper, and those 2 words were Miss Shaw. That is how Delaney Shaw's story ends. And if there is one thing worth carrying with us after all of it, perhaps it is this. The truly strong person isn't the one capable of making other people silent. The strong person is the one willing to sit down and write another person's name, to write it when no one asks, to write it simply because they believe that person's story deserves to be recorded, because isolation is always the first tool evil uses. People are separated one by one, each made to believe that what happened to them belongs only to them, that no one noticed, that speaking up would be useless. But when those people find each other, when they learn each other's names and each other's stories, they stop being targets. And one more thing. In a call answered on the second ring, the hardest part was never whether someone would pick up. The hardest part was daring to dial. So many of us have lifted the phone and then put it back down because we're afraid of bothering someone, because we don't want to owe anyone, because we've been used to handling everything alone for far too long. If today you're keeping a phone number like that in a drawer, I hope you'll try calling it. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so that every day we can listen together to more meaningful stories. How did today's story make you feel? And what part of it made you think the most? Please leave a few lines in the comments below, because we truly want to hear what comes from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in the next video.